Hello, everyone. You are watching the Asian American Herald, a new media network. This show is being aired via live stream on Facebook, and a recording will be available afterwards at our Facebook page, Asian American Herald. My name is Himani Gupta Carlson, and I am a local farmer, writer, and professor at Empire State College in Saratoga Springs, New York. Over the past year, the portrayal of Asian Americans on two popular Netflix serials has been making the news. Mindy Kaling's 7-part romantic drama series Never Have I Ever premiered in April and immediately became the most viewed show in the world. This show featured the life of Devi, an American-born Indian teenager, as she balances expectations of her recently widowed Indian mother against her desires to be a cool kid at her multiracial high school. On the heels of Never Have I Ever came Indian Matchmaking, a much more controversial series in which Indian wedding matchmaker Simi Taparia is shown at work helping a number of young Indian American adults in Mumbai and the US find suitable partners after other efforts such as matrimonial ads failed. Both shows are billed as entertainment. However, subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, they highlight many issues sensitive to Indians and other Asians, such as caste, color, class, and family values and religion. So I'm going to be discussing these series and the discomforts they provoke with three of my academic colleagues, Drs. Melissa Borja and Swapnil Rai of the University of Michigan, and Dr. Rupa Pillai of the University of Pennsylvania. Melissa, Swapnil, and Rupa, welcome to the show. So before we proceed to our guests, I'd like to just offer a little bit of background. Dr. Borja is a contributor to an academic blog known as The Anxious Bench. Her posts often bring in Asian American scholars as guest writers who address issues of religion, histories, and politics. Rupa, Swapnil, and I were guests in June, and we joined Melissa in writing a series of commentaries on Never Have I Ever. And then Indian Matchmaking began streaming on Netflix and generating a firestorm of responses via Twitter, news stories, and interviews. So clearly it seemed that both shows merited some discussion. So let's begin. So first question, all of us are Asian American, yet we occupy different identity spaces within that huge matrix. So I'd actually like to start by asking each of you to say a little bit about who you are, both professionally and personally, and to reflect as well on how that sense of who you are has impacted your reactions to Never Have I Ever and Indian Matchmaking. Rupa, would you like to begin?
Sure, thanks. So a bit about myself. I was born and raised in the Panhandle of Texas. I'm a second generation Indian American, cis Savannah Malayali. And so growing up in Texas in the middle of the Bible Belt was an interesting experience to say the least. And issues of race and religion was a huge part of my growing up, and understanding my difference in different ways, because the majority of my friends were Christian, going to church on Wednesday, Sunday, hanging out there, and that was not part of my experience. And so fast forward into going into academia, and those kind of issues were what I was interested in examining. And so I got a PhD in anthropology and have been exploring issues of race, religion, and migration, particularly with the Guyanese community in New York City. And so the pandemic hit, and we have a lot of time, right, to watch various different things. And in particular, I was very excited, both professionally and personally, for Never Have I Ever, because I have like a love-hate relationship with Mindy Kaling. She's like the Indian American Shonda Rhimes. We need more women of color showrunners, and was a big fan of her writing with The Office. The Diwali episode was really great in highlighting Hinduism in America and the stereotypes. And the potentials of Never Have I Ever in engaging those stereotypes in a different manner, especially being on a streaming platform instead of a studio platform. We could maybe really get into race and religion in different ways. So I was very excited about that. And also, like Indian matchmaking, this is also another topic that was a huge part of my growing up because my parents are arranged marriage. And so having to explain that to my friends when I was younger was interesting, to say the least, of trying to explain what that was. And so both of these coming out at this period of time were like an amazing moment of like, oh, hey, here are a series that can help, explain what these experiences are in America. And, there are some good things, but there's a lot of bad things that we'll get into for sure. So that's kind of my relationship with these two pieces.
Yeah, really, really, really interesting. And lots of what you're saying resonates with me. Melissa, what about you?
So I am not Indian American. I'm Filipina American, born and raised in Saginaw, Michigan. Although I have lived in a lot of different places. I spent many years on the East Coast and 4 years living in California, actually in Davis, which was featured in Never Have I Ever. So I do think as a Midwesterner and as an Asian American in the Midwest, I have lots of thoughts about how region and ethnic identity and racial identity, in addition to religious identity, play out in general. And I was interested in that dynamic on Never Have I Ever, as well as with Indian matchmaking. We see a lot of different regional attitudes present there. And I think that's an issue that Asian American studies scholars are really should pay attention to. As a side note, like everyone else, I was watching a lot of TV during the pandemic because what else are we supposed to do? It felt socially responsible to stay home and watch TV. But I watched it with my preteen daughter. And so I have to say that a lot of my thoughts about Never Have I Ever, and also Indian matchmaking, which I also watched with my preteen daughter, was shaped by thinking about how I'm engaging with this show as an Asian American and as a scholar of these issues, but how it forms the next generation and what questions arise for her. And she's engaging in Asian American cultural forms in a really different way than I am, partly because she's younger, but partly because her world has always been more populated by Asian American characters than mine has. So that is something that I hope we can address at some point in this discussion. And I should say, this is the year of the Indian American in popular culture. I mean, what a year!
Yeah, it is an interesting coincidence that it seems to be happening politically as well as culturally and in popular media. So on that note, Swapnil, I'd like you to say a little bit about yourself and how your sense of who you are impacted your viewings of these two shows, both professionally and personally. So fire away.
Yeah, so my entry into the show and this conversation is interesting because unlike the three of you, I'm a first generation Indian American. I was born in India, in North India, spent most of my life in New Delhi, which is the capital, as all of you know. So I came to the US in my 20s. I first landed in Seattle and quickly made my way to Dallas, where I felt completely at home, the weather, the community. And so before getting into academia, I was a journalist. So I worked as a journalist for some national newspapers in India, also for Thomson Reuters. And then when I moved to Dallas, I saw this huge opportunity because it has such a huge Indian diaspora. So there's literally dedicated Indian movie theaters. There's the whole chain where you exclusively watch Indian movies with samosas. So I totally felt at home in Dallas, and I started editing a magazine for them. I was an executive editor for this one diasporic group, originally run by three brothers from Pakistan that had like this whole media chain. They had movie theaters, they had the Bollywood magazine that I edited, they had FM channels and everything. So I was deeply immersed in that world. And observing it like from a more distanced standpoint, I had all of these questions that I wanted answered about how Indian media was growing and evolving, and that kind of led me to a PhD, which I got also in Texas from UT Austin. So yeah, I've spent like Rupa a long time in Texas. And yeah, so coming from, so even though I am American, I come from this in-between space where if you ask me who do I identify with the most, it would probably be the PhD student in Never Have I Ever, because I have truly looked at America from that lens for a while until, you know, I started feeling that this is my home. So yeah, and I find that the interesting thing about these two shows, like from a media scholar perspective, also comes from this sort of in-betweenness with Netflix's interest in penetrating the Indian market. So in trying to create shows that can actually work across markets, so those are global shows with local resonances that would work both in US and in India. They have messed things up with some of their experiments, and that's why the show Indian Matchmaking got a lot of flack, but it's an interesting experiment nonetheless.
Yeah, thank you. So I need to add my little brief Texas note. I was born in Iowa in 1962. My parents had immigrated just 1 year earlier from New Delhi area. And I grew up mostly in the Midwest, but after I finished my undergrad degree in journalism, I had a number of different newspaper internships before I landed at the Seattle Times, and one of them was at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. And I was so looking forward to 4 months in Texas in the winter, but I have to say that was one of the biggest moments of culture shock that I ever experienced. I think being a very young, immature 22-year-old, probably much like Davy in Never Have I Ever, and landing in Fort Worth among fast cars and big hats and big boots was quite a shock to my system. So someday I need to go back to Texas and take account of all that. So both of these shows, I was trying to think of commonalities between them, and both of them show a piece of Indian America specifically, but Asian America also a little more generally, particularly in Never Have I Ever, as being highly affluent, highly consumptive, very, very overachieving, and almost very lavish in its kind of like lifestyle. There's designer labels, big cars, big houses. The dates that happen in Indian matchmaking are, I've never been on a date like that in my life. And so I'm kind of curious from all of your perspectives, what is truthful and what is troubling about these portrayals? And Swapnil, I'm wondering if you'd like to take that question on first.
Yeah, so especially in regards to Indian matchmaking, I would like to say that they have selected participants that are uber rich. To find somebody with that kind of a home in a city like Mumbai, like that family has to be second only to the Ambanis to be living like that. So definitely they picked like exceptional cases. And it's selling you this kind of aspirational consumption, that kind of lifestyle, which kind of goes to speak to the kind of demographic that Netflix targets. With the kind of subscription there, it has to be a kind of what's the word for it? Somebody that can consume like multiple things from multiple global cultures, but also that comes with a certain income level, a certain aspirational lifestyle. So I think the kind of protagonist that they brought forth in this series is showcasing part of that targeting that Netflix wants to do.
Okay, great points. Rupa, what are your thoughts about what is kind of truthful and what's troubling about what we see in Never Have I Ever and Indian Matchmaking in terms of the conspicuous consumption?
I think it really perpetuates this idea that all Indians and all Indian Americans are crazy hella rich, like we're crazy rich Asians, right? Like there was like one time, like my dad went out somewhere in Texas, and this white Texan came up to him and was like, all you Indians come here and are given Mercedes Benz, right? And it's like this it's this interesting thing that happens where there is affluent Indian Americans, there are affluent Indians, but there are also many people who are not in the upper middle class, who are living at the poverty line. And neither of these shows really examine why these people are rich in this manner. Like there are subtle cues into why, these people in India are able to live in very posh apartments and houses, why these people in America are able to like fly off to Chicago for a date, right? Like there are reasons for that. And that has a lot to do with selective migration and people who are coming to the United States already with certain, with like preferred degrees that help them to be able to earn at a higher rate and to spend in that ability. And so for me, it becomes interesting in the way that it has the potential of getting people to talk about why people are this rich, but it doesn't seem to come out if you're not going to interrogate the way that you're viewing it.
Yeah, so it's a truthful portrayal, but it's a truthful portrayal of a limited group of people that nevertheless then perpetuates certain stereotypes. So Melissa, as the non-Indian American in our group, but nevertheless part of our Asian American family, give us your thoughts on the levels of consumption that we see in Never Have I Ever and in Indian Matchmaking. Swapnil referred to Rupa actually referred to Crazy Rich Asians, and I'm wondering, are there connections across different ethnic groups within the Asian American community that you can see?
So I think it's, as we talk about this, important to remember that TV shows and movies generally portray middle class, upper middle class, and rich people. And in general, we don't watch that many shows about working class people and poor people. And so I think that is a pre-existing situation we should acknowledge. But I think it's particularly true for Asian Americans. And we see that with this show, and we see that in other contexts. So I love Never Have I Ever for so many reasons, because it was diverse in so many ways. It had different ethnic groups. It had different religious communities. It had Asian Americans who weren't just into math and science. I felt totally seen by the character, Eleanor, the drama nerd. That was me in high school. And I didn't see enough when I was in high school of Asian American girls who could be into theater and not into engineering or medicine. And so for me, I thought this show was in many ways bringing a more nuanced, diverse portrait of Asian Americans in so many ways. And so that's why, in a way, I was kind of disappointed by the lack of class diversity on Never Have I Ever. And for sure, the consumptive character of Indian matchmaking was an issue, it did make me wonder how they found these people, what the background was for the selection of the characters. So at least for Never Have I Ever, the choice of having the story center on children of doctors and dentists really reproduce the model minority narrative that is problematic for lots and lots of reasons, not least because it papers over the reality of people who are working class or poor in the United States and also happen to be Asian American. As an aside, while I was watching Never Have I Ever, I was having a conversation with another Asian American friend who pointed out that news media coverage of Asian Americans almost always focuses on their upward mobility and their success and almost never covers their experiences of poverty and economic hardship. And she gave one example of how a New York Times article drawing on research done by Columbia Business School scholars had found that people of color, Black, Latino, and Asian American people were experiencing greater economic hardship than white people. However, the New York Times only published graphs about Black and Latino hardship and did not include the data about Asian Americans. That was a choice that I think is in many ways reinforced by narratives we see on TV shows like Never Have I Ever. So yeah, to have those two stories merge at the same time was really helpful.
Yeah, that is so interesting. That actually makes me think about critiques of shows like The Cosby Show back in the late 80s, early 90s, that there were, it was portraying a certain aspect of African American life, but it wasn't a full one. It was a very, very limited class-based one that fed into audience desires to see themselves on the screen. And, while it is just absolutely refreshing to see Asian American and Indian American faces on a TV series, I certainly never saw that when I was growing up. That class issue is kind of problematic. So we're starting to run a little tight on time. So I'm actually going to shift a little of our discussion over to Indian matchmaking. I want to point to a guide that was prepared by Viraj Patel. And that guide was actually very helpful because it noted that there could be aspects in this serial that would provoke triggers, and pointed to issues of caste supremacy, memories of having to go through an arranged marriage process, intergenerational conflicts, other kinds of different dilemmas. And so for me personally, I really felt like that show reveals the superficiality of arranged dating, and that it does normalize certain ideas of fair skin as being desirable, and that you're marrying not just a life partner, but a family. And on one hand, I think it's really healthy to bring these issues out, but it seems that the protests over the series suggests that many people think otherwise. And so one of my questions is why? And just kind of focusing in on caste maybe a little bit. What's problematic about showing how caste among Indians in America actually is hidden in plain sight? And since we now see it in a show like Indian Matchmaking, how could we start developing some useful dialogue around what the series portrays? I think, Rupa, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to take that question up first.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Because I was thinking about it, like part of, the response I was having with the show is like, oh my gosh, this is horrid. Like we're seeing all this. This is again going to perpetuate like Indian culture being backward and casteist. But it should be out there to be critiqued. But I think part of the issue is the fact that, yes, it's hidden and present, but being able to understand the subtle ways that it's acting requires us to have those critical conversations, to have an accompanying guide like Viraj Patel has created to do that education aspect of it. But I think it's also particularly interesting at this moment when we have Isabel Wilkinson's book that's just come out on caste and talking about using this idea of caste to think through the way that race is operating in the United States. And so that, as well as the organizing that's happening with Equality Labs in getting caste prejudice and discrimination seen and recognized within the United States through the efforts of filing lawsuits against Cisco, we're at this moment where we are actually starting to engage with caste and rendering it visible in a manner that people outside the Indian American community can start to have a conversation and understand and participate in that conversation. So I think that it is kind of the right moment where we can have those conversations and potentially think beyond the Indian American context and the Indian context of how maybe caste is operating in different communities and different societies in different ways. So I think it can be productive. I'm not sure how to do it with just like binging it on Netflix.
Yeah, good point. Swapnil, you've had the experience, of course, of growing up in India and, living in a space where caste is much more evident than it might be here. What is your take on kind of what Indian matchmaking gives us and what the protests and the kind of the dialogue that has developed around it is telling us, and what can we do with that? How can we work with it all?
So I wanted to point out two things. First is, after this show came out, and I'm kind of giving you the more industrial standpoint. So after the show came out, there's a story in the Hollywood Reporter that talked about how Indian matchmaking was commissioned by Netflix in the US without any consultation with Netflix India. And that became kind of a sore point because Indian matchmaking is presenting India for a Western audience in a more exoticized perspective that, oh, well, so it's all destiny, but there's also the caste, and then you can read face auras and you can match horoscopes. So like it's building up on the genre that's producing for its global audience with Love is Blind and other shows, where it's selling this idea of destiny and love for a Western group. And now this was their opportunity to kind of put a local flavor, an interesting local flavor, because arranged marriages anyway happened in India. So it's presenting to you like ideas of caste that are super problematic without comment. And that's kind of the critique that a person that's lives in an in-between world, say like me, that understands the Indian perspective and where caste and arranged marriages now in India, and I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it does not exist in the same way. It has handpicked to showcase stories where, caste and matching horoscopes exists in the same way. And if you look on YouTube, there's tons of videos and comments of Indian people talking about it. So it's presenting caste like in an archaic way without comment. Arranged marriages do not exist in the same way, even in India. And that is not to say that caste and other differences do not exist. And also to conflate the idea of caste and color. Like colorism is the more problematic thing when it comes to India, because I could be a Brahmin, but I could have a family member that's much darker in complexion, and that can be a problem when it's time to get them married. Doesn't matter if it's an arranged marriage or not, right? That's kind of the sad thing about colorism in India. So the problem with Indian matchmaking is it's presenting to you things like in a purely consumptive way as this exoticized other that you can, devour, enjoy, but it's not problematizing anything. There has to be, as Rupa said, some sort of background commentary on why it is what it is.
Wow, that That is really, really interesting. And you know what it makes me think about is we know we're getting a second season of Never Have I Ever, and we're all kind of maybe looking forward to what it might provoke. What might be even better with a series of dialogue, a series of what is it that we can actually learn and glean from this. So, Melissa, would you like to just take a minute or two to kind of take up that question, caste and colorism, and you teach as well as write for the Anxious Bench and engage in numerous groups of scholars. What do you see as problematic about the portrayals of caste and colorism in Indian matchmaking, and how might we turn those into useful dialogues for our students and for others?
I think the absence of context is really something that we need to think about. It's been interesting to see the responses to the show, Indian matchmaking, among my Indian friends, Indian American friends, and my Asian American friends who are not Indian, and my white friends. And I think almost universally there's a fascination with it. Like, it's compulsively watchable. But I think the people who identify as Asian American, and certainly Indian American, feel very conflicted about it, worried about what sort of ideas are reproduced about Indian people more broadly. And there isn't that same willingness to be self-critical about engaging in this type of consumption among my white friends. And so whenever we portray Asian and Asian American people on television in the United States, it always raises to me the question of what stories is this advancing? Who are we centering these stories on? What harm is it doing? And shows like Indian matchmaking, and to a lesser degree, Never Have I Ever, because it is very specifically American, really do a lot in shaping how Americans see India. And I think the absence of context is really, really tricky.
Yeah. And I just feel like that's actually, it's a continuation of an ongoing issue. How India has been seen by an American audience, has been, it's been written about it's been ongoing for, more than a century. And it's often in these either highly exoticized ways or in these kind of very backward, impoverished, poor country kind of ways. So I think a lot more critical consciousness would really help us further. So on that note, we are out of time. I really want to thank the three of you for joining me tonight on this show. And I would like to invite you actually to stay in the studio for a few minutes afterwards, so I can just further thank you and we can chat a little bit further. And for everyone else, thank you for joining us this evening for our weekly Asian American Herald show. I'm Himani Gupta Carlson, and our guests have been Professors Melissa Borja and Swapnil Rai of the University of Michigan and Professor Rupa Pillai of the University of Pennsylvania. The Asian American Herald is a Facebook-based news media outlet dedicated to discussing topics and building community among Asian Americans in the capital region of New York and in the world beyond. So please send us your story ideas and look for the recording of this show on our Facebook page. Have a good evening. Thank you all.